Another weekend brings another opportunity for a signature win for IU.
You are Locked On Hoosiers, your daily podcast on the Indiana Hoosiers. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day.
What is up, everybody? Welcome into another episode of Locked On Hoosiers. I'm your host, as always, Jacob Rude. Want to thank you guys for making us your first listen every single day, including this Friday. Today's episode is brought to you by BetOnline. BetOnline has you covered this season with more props, odds, and lines than ever before. BetOnline, where the game starts. Coming off the loss to Arizona last weekend, this was the gauntlet portion of IU's schedule. They head into Allen Fieldhouse in Kansas this weekend. To preview that game, I brought on one of my good friends, the assistant sports editor at the Kansas City Star, Scott Chasen. And Scott, there has not been much of a championship hangover for Kansas this season. They're kind of flying along. How's the season been going for the Jayhawks?
Yeah, I mean, look, it's got me a little bit surprised. For those who don't know, I've covered Kansas. I mean, going back to even before I was in college, I was writing about them for a blog. But, there are really, really good Kansas teams that enter the season and they're top five, whatever. And this team was in there kind of in the rankings. I know they just dropped just because some other teams had impressive wins. But this team, it lost a lot from the national championship team.
Yeah.
You lose probably inarguably your three, maybe four of your five best players, give or take, between, Ochai Agbaji and Christian Brown, who are both off to the NBA. David McCormick, a much maligned at time big man for KU. Bill Self still wanted to play through him. And so you lose that kind of identity. And then you lose a guy in Remy Martin who wasn't even there the whole year, but made a bunch of key plays when they needed them, especially in that national championship game. So I think what you've seen is Jalen Wilson has stepped up. Dajuan Harris, the ever steady Kansas point guard, his stats are unassuming, but Bill Self will tell you more often than not he's the most important player in the game. Those guys have been pretty good. And then you add a star freshman like Gradey Dick. And yeah, Kansas has been way better than I thought. Jacob, I was telling people before the season, this team looked like a 3 to 6 seed. To me, which for a lot of programs is great. Bill Self has never been worse than a 4 at Kansas. So when you say that, people start to freak out here and say, no, that would be awful. A 4, 5, 6 seed would be considered his worst team. Certainly it hasn't looked that way early. The Jayhawks had one stumble when they had some foul trouble, and injury trouble against Tennessee. And other than that, they've pretty much rolled.
Yeah, as I was looking up, just kind of previewing this Kansas team, I watched Kansas kind of through the tournament last season. I didn't recognize a single name. I had to double check to make sure I hadn't just forgotten. Outside of Jalen Wilson, that was about the only name I remember. Has this team not really had that many kind of chemistry issues, learning moments, anything like that so far this year?
Yeah, it's crazy. I'd point to Texas Tech transfer Kevin McCullar. Which, as an aside, Jalen Wilson has brought like so many different players to Kansas, and he's referred to each of them as his best friend, and it's been kind of a funny thing. Then he played against Dajuan Harris, and that was his best friend. They recruited RJ Hampton, who's in the NBA. That was his best friend. So maybe that helps. I don't know. He's friends with everyone. But Kevin McCullar, for example, had kind of a slow start, was kind of filling in, figuring out what he does well for this team. And then, after a few games, he kind of just took off. And I think one of the reasons why they haven't had those issues is Bill Self likes to play a short rotation. And I think people on the beating at Kansas always talk about, well, by March, he's got his 7 guys. But Jacob, I'd tell you the first game of the season, and Bill Self wasn't even on the bench. It was Norm Roberts filling in for him. KU already had a 7-man rotation. And that was pretty much from the word go. And almost, I guess everyone but one of them was someone who had been in college basketball for a while. KJ Adams is not Kansas's most talented big man. They've got other higher ranked recruits or guys who maybe have that higher ceiling, but he was in this program last year, and Bill Self trusted him on the final play of the national championship game to be on the court for defense because that's what he does. And Bill Self trusts him. And so I think when you talk about chemistry, you're seeing that Bill Self might look at a guy like, for example, MJ Rice, a 5-star freshman, and say, you're really talented, but I don't know that I can trust you to be talented with all these other people and make it all work on the court. And you really see that in how he plays rotation. So long answer just to say, yeah, it's a bunch of new faces, but Bill Self has looked for those combinations that work best together. And I think that's one of the things he does best as a coach.
And part of what's made all this so surprising is their schedule has not been easy. You obviously have the Duke game, and then Wisconsin, they beat in overtime. The loss to Tennessee, but then wins over Seton Hall, Missouri. All those are top 65 Ken Palm teams. How much has this schedule challenged this team so far?
Well, it has, and it's challenged them in different ways. I don't think any of us, and I've watched about half of Missouri's games just being here at the Star. I don't think any of us know how good that team is, maybe even still. But I'll tell you, that environment was crazy. I can tell you, just being around it, Missouri fans do not like Kansas. And when they're chanting, FKU an hour and a half before the game and running up on another team's bus or something, I saw like their fan section tweeted about that. I guess they thought somebody was KU and they weren't even that. I mean, that's as hostile an environment as you can go to. Yep. And, candidly, I kind of thought Kansas might lose that game. And I don't mean to come off like this big pessimist, but you got all these new faces. You got a star freshman in Gradey Dick who's never dealt with anything like the vitriol and hatred that you get in a crowd like that, in a rivalry like that dates back over 100 years. It dates back to history, not just sports. So for them to play that well, I thought that was really the one that maybe raised expectations a little bit. And I thought that was a different kind of test, because it's one thing to be tested by playing good teams, which for the most part they've survived, especially Duke. They found a way to grind that one out when guys weren't shooting well, and they rarely, do in that first test of the season, the Champions Classic. But yeah, Missouri tested them in a different way. And I think that should give them some confidence. The only thing I'd say is maybe you worry a little bit about a letdown spot, because it was really easy to get energized for that game. And it probably pretty easy to get energized for Indiana coming into town too. So maybe this won't be it, but I could very easily see that energy kind of dropping off a little after a game like that.
The last thing I want to touch on before we talk more specifics about this team, a friend of ours, a mutual friend, keyed me in on Bill Self's record at Allen Fieldhouse. I jokingly, he asked me what I thought the win percentage was for him. I said, it's really good. I don't know, like 95%. That was a joke. That was me aiming high. It's 94.8%. He is 292-16 in Allen Fieldhouse. He's won as many league titles as he has losses at the venue. I guess that means at this point, if you lose a game, you win a league title, which feels like a pretty fair trade-off. What makes Kansas so good at home?
Kansas fans are nuts. And I say that affectionately as a guy who, as a freshman, was in the student section and then, obviously covering the team. Allen Fieldhouse, there will be people who tell you they walk around in there and they can, hear the ghosts of basketball past or something. I don't know that it's that. I know Kansas fans are crazy. And I've told this story before, but I like to use it because, Jacob, I'm a Suns fan. And I went to a Western Conference Final playoff game, a game in which the Suns won on a game-winning dunk at the buzzer with, a second left. And it was a crazy atmosphere and packed house and raucous environment. And, ESPN called it the best environment in basket in the NBA that they'd been at that year. And Stephen A. Smith was there and all that. I would tell you a random Tuesday game that KU plays against Toledo and Allen Fieldhouse might be louder than that. And the fans are packed in. Like, it's really old-timey. It's small. There's not a bad seat because it's not necessarily the most comfortable viewing experience to go sit on the benches there, but it's all packed. They're right there on top of you. The students are on both ends. And man, it gets loud. It gets crazy. They have all these videos that, like, if the game is tight late, they're sounding off sirens and firing people up. And, you don't think it makes that much of a difference, but you hear stories like Scott Drew pulling his Baylor team off the court because he didn't want them to watch the pregame video and get intimidated with all the fans yelling. Or like West Virginia, the number of times that West Virginia was up, I think they were up like 15 with 2.5 minutes left. And it just got nuts and crazy. And KU forces a couple turnovers. Now all of a sudden the ref who's counting, the 5 seconds to inbound, he called him for like a 5-second violation on the third count or something, because the refs are now starting to get a little bit swayed. It's a crazy environment. There's nothing else like it. And I've been to, not everywhere, but like I've been to Rupp for Kentucky. I've been a few places. it's just a crazy environment with a lot of history. And then obviously Kansas has had really good teams. And yeah, Kansas gets a call. Every now and again, one might say you get some Allen Fieldhouse advantage there too. So it's probably a mix of all of that. But if you ask Bill Self, he would just tell you it's the players. But yeah, for a long time they had more conference titles than they did home losses. So I guess they've been slipping.
Yeah, you mentioning that the ref only counting to 3, I'm going to use that as an excuse right away. If anything happens on Saturday, we're going to talk about some of the players more specifically and what they bring to the table here in a moment. First, though, betonline.net is your number one source for sports betting info, stats, news, and analysis. Get the latest odds, trends, whatever you guys need from pro football, the bowl seasons coming up, basketball, World Cup, everything you guys need. BetOnline is always the fastest and easiest way to get your betting info. Head to the website today or use your mobile device to learn more. BetOnline, where the game starts. I want to thank you guys for making Locked On Hoosiers your first listen today. For your second listen, check out Locked On Sports Today. From the games that matter the most to the biggest stories in sports, go beyond the scoreboard and behind the scenes with local experts and insights only Locked On can provide. Locked On Sports Today, available on this app, YouTube, wherever you guys listen to your favorite podcasts at. I want to talk specifics about this Kansas team, some of the players on it. If you just look at their Ken Palm page, there's green everywhere. They're the 14th ranked team in adjusted offensive efficiency, 11th in defense. There isn't many weak spots on this team outside of free throw shooting. So I guess, should IU come in and immediately start hacking and play the free throw game from the get-go?
Well, I'll tell you what, if you look at KJ Adams, I don't know what he's up to now, but I can say he started the year like 0 of 11 or something on free throws. So whatever he is, he's probably at 30-something%. That's because he's red hot now.
So he's 8 of 21, so he's went 8 of 10 since that.
So there you go. Yeah, not a great shooting team. Gradey Dick can make them. Dajuan Harris, when left wide open, can make them, but he's not really much of a shooter. Jalen Wilson has always been described to me as more of a scorer than a shooter, which, you know, sometimes people conflate the two. He came to Kansas as like that scoring threat. And then I remember over the summer, the first scrimmage I watched him in, I think he went like 1 of 12 from 3. And it was like, maybe he's got to find some other ways to get his points. His jumper looks good. He just doesn't go in. Free throw shooting is a weakness. It's funny to hear those rankings because I think the defense is not where Bill Self wants it to be, especially because the 5-man spot is so important in a Bill Self defense. And while he likes KJ Adams is not a particularly great or even good defensive rebounder, which is arguably the biggest part of defense is getting that board. And he doesn't have the size really. He can rim protect by being more of like a lane protector and a paint protector just because he's so strong and being in good positions. And he did block a dunk with a pretty cool highlight against Missouri, but he's not really, as big or as long as some of the other centers they've had. And then the backups are pretty much exclusively freshmen at this point. KU has the guy, Zach Clements, they thought they were going to rely on. They thought he might start for this team. And I can't imagine having a worse start to the year than he is. I mean, he was billed as this shooter, and that's what he was in high school, a stretch 5. And I don't think he's made a 3 on the year. He might not have made a shot yet on the year. And in fact, the game winner they had against Wisconsin, he bricked a shot, and the point guard ran in, caught the offensive rebound, and put it back up with a reverse layup, backup point guard Bobby Pettiford. So Kansas is not where it wants to be on either end, but yeah, they still have been pretty good. It's kind of that weird dichotomy of the elite teams, that top 10, 15, where like being 14th in offense sounds good. But if you're Kansas, if you're Bill Self and you want to win a national championship, you've probably got to raise that another 5, 6, 7, 8 spots. And that's really hard to do.
One area you kind of alluded to, in one area that would be interesting for IU fans, IU has been a pretty good rebounding team with Trayce Jackson-Davis around, and Kansas has struggled in that area at times this year. Against Wisconsin, they got out-rebounded, against Tennessee, they got out-rebounded by a lot, 40-26. Has rebounding been one of the weaknesses as well with this team?
Yeah, defensive rebounding especially. Jalen Wilson's probably their best defensive rebounder, and they'll let him go back to the glass and then start a break in transition, but they don't want to have to rely on him for everything because he's already using a huge amount of their offensive possessions His volume is probably unsustainable. And then they don't necessarily have a bunch of those guys around that are like, oh, well, this guy grabs 5 defensive rebounds, even though he's a guard. Or like, I always remember like Frank Mason would grab 3 or 4 at the point guard position. And that's not really what they have right now. So yeah, I would say defensive rebounding is one of the biggest weaknesses of this team, which I'm sure does drive Bill Self crazy because he talks about it all the time. And that being one of the biggest stats in games. So yeah, when I was kind of looking over this matchup just in advance of this and reading some of the coverage we've even had on our site from our KU beat reporters, that's been the thing. It's been rebounding. It's been, Trayce Jackson-Davis. Is he going to get, he averages 3 or 4 offensive boards a game. Is he going to get 6, 7, 8? I mean, KJ Adams averages 4.5 rebounds total per game. KU is outside the top 150 in defensive rebound percentage in college basketball. I mean, those numbers are not where they need to be. So it's a definite weakness for KU.
Yeah, as you were saying, Duke had 16 offensive rebounds. Tennessee had 12. NC State had 11. Missouri had 10. So that specifically could be an area where IU, who has been good at offensive rebounds, their numbers have slipped a little bit. But as you said, it's an area where Trayce has a ton of success in. And kind of on that note of Trayce and big men, we've mentioned him a lot, but Jalen Wilson has taken a huge step this season, doubled his scoring. What's kind of led to him kind of taking this role as the leader of this team now?
Well, I think he has more opportunity now. And I think, I don't want to say it's solely a volume increase because I don't think he was the type of player who could have put up these numbers last year. I think his efficiency would have dipped in a big way if he was on this volume. But I think as he's gotten more comfortable and kind of grown from, sort of a third, fourth option at times in his career, he's had to be more than that. And now he's kind of seen the other wings he played with, 2 guys who went to the NBA, were first-round draft picks, and in Christian Brown's case is absolutely killing it with the Denver Nuggets. He's seen what those guys did and kind of had this advantage to get to sit back, watch, contribute, and learn how college defenses work, learn how Bill Self's system works. The things he does really well, he's a good driver. He can be creative to kind of get to the rim, draw contact, or finish inside. Definite transition threat. He'll grab it and go up the floor. And Jalen Wilson is at his best when the game is really fast paced, but that doesn't mean when it slows down. If Kansas has to have an isolation or something late shot clock, yeah, it's probably get the ball to Jalen Wilson and just let him run into somebody and see if he can make a tough shot or, draw some free throws. So I've been impressed by his physical maturity. He's always had like really strong legs. I think he mentioned he gets that from his parents. And that's allowed him to kind of battle with guys that are bigger than him because a lot of times he's had to play the 5 spot for KU as sort of an undersized 5. And that's probably been more of an indictment on KU center play over the last few years. But this year, they're really using him as that 4, as that wing piece. So he'll have to help out on the inside too against Trayce Jackson-Davis, I'm sure. But KU has put a lot on his shoulders, and so far he has absolutely delivered. And, when you consider his number 2 scoring threat as a true freshman, that's not necessarily ideal team setup, right? Gradey Dick's been phenomenal, but that's you never really, unless it's like a, no doubt blue chip 5-star NBA guy, you really don't want to rely on your second best guy to be in that kind of position. And Gradey Dick has stepped up, Jalen Wilson stepped up, and then kind of everyone else has gone from there.
That was going to be my last question, is just kind of the other guys around Jalen Wilson. It seems like in some senses a balanced attack as much as the 7-man rotation can kind of allow, I guess. Who are some of the other guys to watch out for in this one?
Well, Gradey Dick has an NBA game. And he takes shots like I've always described. There are different levels of shooters. You got your stationary catch and shoot guys that in college, sometimes people will be like, this guy's one of the best 3-point shooters in the nation. It's like, yeah, when he's standing in the corner, gets a perfect pass and he's wide open, he can knock down 40% of those threes. That's great. You can do that, go with like one of those shooting guns to the gym, to your local rec and get those shots too. So that's the first level. Then there's like off movement, coming off screens. And Ochai Agbaji was phenomenal with that for KU. Then there's off the dribble. And then there's like create your own 3, shoot over a tight window. And that's the tier Gradey Dick is in. He is 6'8", he's got length. He has a really quick release. He can do it, while being mobile. He shoots in transition. Bill Self does not like guys running in transition to the 3-point line and launching a three, but he's okay with Gradey Dick doing it because he's really good at it. So I think it starts there after Jalen Wilson. Dajuan Harris, not much of a scorer, but he sets everyone up. They're in the right spots. And you saw when he was out of the game with foul trouble against Tennessee, and I think he fouled out in like 18 minutes in that game, Kansas's offense fell off a cliff and was just absolutely nowhere to be found. So he's not much of an offensive threat, but he runs the offense. He dictates it. He's not quite the quote unquote true point guard thing. That doesn't really mean anything anymore, but that he is, in a sense, the guy who runs the show. And then on the inside, KU's figuring it out. KJ Adams has scored, I think, double digits a few games in a row. He's not a scorer. The backups really aren't a scorer, but they are good rim runners. They're athletic. They can be lob threats. So I think it's a mix of that. And then anything you get from the other guys, Kevin McCullar, Joe Yesufu off the bench. Yesufu can make shots from the outside. McCullar can make shots from the outside. But those are really the bonus guys that you would say, if they're scoring, KU is really, really hard to beat. And if they're not, okay, you got a game. And let's see who's going to make more plays.
Makes for a very interesting battle between the two sides. We'll talk about where IU could potentially exploit some weaknesses and some matchups to watch in this one. Before we do that, let's get serious here for a second. It can happen so easily. You're out with your friends or coworkers. You're putting back a few drinks. A few becomes too many. It's time to go. And for a moment, you think of calling for a ride. But nah, you're a good driver. You live nearby. You can make it home okay. And what are the odds you'll get pulled over? Even so, what's the worst that could happen? It only takes one mistake to change your life or someone else's forever. Play it safe and plan ahead to get a ride. Drive sober or get pulled over. Let's talk about when things haven't been going well for Kansas this season. We mentioned rebounding would be one of them. Is there anything else that has kind of plagued this team a little bit?
Yeah, I think they go through stretches with the short rotation where they get worn out. And particularly when Jalen Wilson is off the court or Gradey Dick isn't making shots, or maybe he's in a lull. He's a freshman. There are going to be those stretches where he kind of disappears, or maybe they're not getting him the ball. Kansas becomes a lot more beatable. And, it really wasn't an issue against Missouri because Kansas won by so much. But I think Gradey Dick started 6 of 6 in that game, and I think he ended like 6 for 11. And that's kind of been the story of this team at times. They look really, really good. And sometimes, like the Seton Hall game, they're able to kind of keep it going and blow a team out. And other times they kind of let a team creep back in, or they're not making enough shots. The bench of this team is a problem. I think the stat was, well, now I'm going to butcher it, but off the top of my head, Kansas had like only one player off the bench score more than 2 points in a game for like 7 or 8 straight games, which is just atrocious. I mean, they don't get bench scoring. When those guys come in, it's directly tied to when the lead gets cut down. It's very NBA-like in that perspective, where, Missouri was the example. KU's up huge, up 20 plus. And then all of a sudden it's a 15-point game. And you're like, why is it a 15-point game? Oh, KU has 3 bench guys in the game. So they really can't afford at this point to use their bench for long stretches, which is a problem, which does come back to bite them. I think that defensive rebounding and, foul trouble to me in this game is something that could absolutely be a factor. Bill Self, his kind of specialty has been when other teams have that one elite player, he figures out a really good game plan against them. And sometimes it doesn't always work. I can remember Buddy Hield scoring 46 points against Kansas in the triple overtime game in Allen Fieldhouse. Although Bill Self would tell you that Frank Mason guarded his ass off in that game. And as someone who was there, Buddy Hield just hit some shots that, I mean, good God, you don't know what to say when he does. But I mean, you think what KU did at times to Trae Young. KU held Trae Young scoreless for a half when they played against him, or that was Buddy Hield. They held scoreless against that for a half. KU really held Trae Young down. He had good numbers, but he really had to work. They made him really inefficient. That's kind of the Bill Self model when he goes against these teams. You think about that Duke matchup in the Elite Eight a few years back, where KU put an undersized Svi Mikhailuk against Marvin Bagley, and it worked. Svi had a double-double, and KU devised a really good defense against Wendell Carter and Marvin Bagley to get a win in a game that they were a heavy underdog. So I think that's the Bill Self specialty, but at the same time, I'm not sure this team is experienced enough to be able to do as much on either end of the court as Bill Self would like. And so that probably makes them more vulnerable in a matchup like this against a superstar.
It's interesting because it's an interesting chess match that might be, because IU has been dealing with defenses absolutely loading up on Trayce Jackson-Davis in the last few weeks. That Rutgers loss, the Arizona loss, and they've been figuring out how to be successful when teams take him entirely out of the game. So giving Bill Self a week to devise a game plan to do that could lead to IU needing to figure that out again. Also, will be interesting with the bench, because when Jalen Hood-Schifino plays, which knock on wood he will, IU's bench has been really good this season. So that could be an area where IU has the advantage in this one. Obvious matchup to watch in this is Trayce Jackson-Davis versus whoever, Jalen Wilson, whoever it is in that front court. Really Trayce and Race versus KU's front court. Have they went up against anyone kind of with the size IU has, and how have they fared against them?
I think Duke would be the example.
Yeah.
Kyle Filipowski for them had like a huge game against Kansas, but that game was, it was not very artistic. It was a lot of bricks. I'd be shocked if the rims were still on the hoops at the end of those games. So yeah, I mean, KU's had to bog down a game like that before, and it went okay. They got the win. But what happened was it really tired the team out, and Jalen Wilson was the case of that. You remember Kobe's last game where he shot like 60 times?
Yeah.
That was Jalen Wilson, the college version of that, and where like at the end of the game, like they're just like, "Wait, what are we running?" I don't know. Just give him the ball and just like go do something, and if it goes in, it goes in. And KU did just enough to creep over the finish line. So, and they got a little bit of a flurry from Gradey Dick, who also got tired in that game. So, yeah, it's interesting. The normally Kansas has deeper teams, and it's more of a case of like, who does Bill Self want to play / like, if someone messes up, he's okay, you're out of the game. I'm just going to go get someone else. And this team really doesn't have that, because it's a huge risk to say like, Dajuan Harris has had some foul trouble issues in a couple games, and Bill Self kind of called him out for that, even though Bill Self loves Dajuan Harris. He's one of his favorite ever players, but it's not really a case where Dajuan Harris commits a dumb foul and he's going to say, okay, Joe Yesufu, you're running point, because the drop off has been so stark. So yeah, that it really is one advantage in one place where, if IU can really pound them inside and really make this a game of front court versus front court, they can wear Kansas out absolutely, and they can get them into some foul trouble.
It'll be interesting to see what role Malik Renew could play in that as well. He's struggled the last couple weeks as the competition has kind of cranked up, but Mike Woodson talked this week about basically potentially letting him play through some of the foul troubles. Mike Woodson is one of I was trying to find the stat here on KenPom, 2 foul participation. He does not. If you get 2 fouls in the first half, you're done. And Malik Renew has gotten 2 fouls in the first half real quick. And he basically said this week, maybe I just need to let him play through it, because he's not really playing otherwise. So stuff like that will be the interesting chess match in this one. Scott, thanks a ton for coming on. Let the people know where they can find you and any of their work if they're interested as well.
Yeah, well, I'm on Twitter at Chasen Scott, and I still, even though I'm not on the KU beat anymore, I still do a lot of stuff with KU coverage and work with our writers on that. And yeah, kansascity.com is the link for the Kansas City Star. And I will just add on the note of playing guys with 2 fouls. That is not a Bill Self thing. He does not play you with 2 fouls. And one time he had David McCormick fell out of a game in 4 minutes. So David McCormick especially did not have permission to play with 2 fouls. So maybe you can understand that one a little bit.
It could get a little ugly in that regard then on Saturday. Thanks again for coming on. Thank you to you guys for making us your first listen every day. We'll be back with you on Monday to recap this game. For your next listen, check out the Locked On Sports Today podcast, the biggest stories of the day, plus instant reactions, big game recaps, and the take of the day, available on the Odyssey app, YouTube, and wherever you get podcasts. You can follow us on Twitter at LO_Hoosiers. Subscribe to the podcast, all that fun stuff. As always, guys, I hope you have a great weekend, and LEO.